Would you like to know about an old school photo sharpening trick that's been largely forgotten about? This technique was often used to sharpen grainy film scans without exaggerating the grain or making it look ugly. But this technique isn't just for sharpening grainy film images. You see, it has a side effect when used on digital photography that makes details pop as if the image was in 3D. I'll demonstrate this with this image I shot at Zabriskie Point in Death Valley. I shot it handheld using an exposure of a 50th of a second using f5 and ISO 80. The camera I was using at the time was a first generation Sony RX100 pocket camera. If we magnify the image with no sharpening applied, you can see that it's in focus but quite soft. I can address this to some degree by applying capture sharpening using the sharpening controls in Lightroom. But it's very easy for me to push the amount and detail sliders too far. When I do that, we see the image starts to look what I can only describe as crunchy. One way to reduce this effect is to use the Lightroom masking slider. This is used to limit the pixels that are sharpened. If I hold down the Option key on my keyboard, which is Alt on a Windows PC, when I move the masking slider, we can see what's selected for sharpening. The areas in white are where the sharpening is being applied. As you can see, by moving the slider to the right, we'll limit the sharpening so that it's applied to the edges in the image rather than all the pixels. This type of sharpening that I've applied is intended to reduce the softness in an image that's being caused by the digital capture. However, the problem with this image is that while the softness is gone, the detail still isn't that clear. And this is a problem that can affect lots of images, which is where our new sharpening trick can help. However, to apply the fix, we need a photo editor like Adobe Elements or Photoshop. That's because we need to use a filter called the Unsharp Mask. While many photo editors have an Unsharp Mask filter, not many allow you to use the settings that we're going to use. I have a couple of examples that will demonstrate the technique, starting with our image open in Photoshop. Now, because the Unsharp Mask filter is a destructive edit that's applied directly to the image pixels, we'll sharpen a duplicate layer. I'll create this by right-clicking on the image layer and choosing Duplicate. Or I can use the keyboard shortcut of Command and J with the image layer selected. If you're using a Windows PC rather than a Mac, that's Control and J. Then, to apply the filter, I ensure the duplicate layer is selected in the Layers panel. I can then click the Filter menu, followed by the Sharpen submenu, where I can select the Unsharp Mask filter. Typically, when we sharpen an image with lots of fine detail like this one, we use a small radius setting of a pixel or less. We then control the strength of the sharpening using the Amount slider. The higher the amount setting, the stronger the sharpening effect that's applied. The threshold slider then works just like we saw in Lightroom. The problem though with this type of sharpening, as we saw when we used it in Lightroom, is that we can exaggerate the image detail but not make it pop. Let's move all the sliders to 0 now so I can show you the solution. This time, rather than using a small radius setting, we'll use a high radius, one that matches the sensor size of the image. As the camera used for this image was 20 megapixel, I'll start with a radius of 20. But you can often push the radius higher still and achieve good results. Now, watch what happens as I move the Amount slider to the right. You can see the larger details in the scene become clearer and the landscape begins to look three-dimensional. Look at the difference when I turn the preview off and then on. Let's cancel that for a moment and then magnify the image to 200% because I want to show you the effect on the fine details in the image. Here's a section from the foreground landscape. Now let's open the Unsharp Mask filter again from the Filter menu. This time I'll set the Amount slider to 30% and increase the Radius slider gradually. At 1 pixel the sharpening effect is hardly visible. But at 10 pixels it's becoming more obvious. Then at 30 pixels The effect is clear and it emphasises the larger details. And look at the effect on more distant areas of the landscape. Everything is now sharper, clearer and just snaps into focus. Now let's zoom to fit the image onto the screen by pressing Command and 0 or Control and 0 on a Windows PC. If I turn off the preview, you can see the filter's effect is completely different to the low radius, high amount sharpening we looked at earlier. Now, a word of warning before we go to our next example. When you're doing this type of sharpening using a high radius setting, you need to limit the amount. If you increase the amount much beyond 30%, you'll produce a nasty effect. We now see halos appear everywhere because we've applied too much sharpening. Now let's look at a second example using a different image. This is another shot with the Sony RX100 from the same morning. If I magnify this to 200%, you can see that it's already been sharpened and contains plenty of fine detail. Let's see though how it responds to our old school sharpening method. I'll start by duplicating the background image layer so we can apply the sharpening to that. I'll then set the image magnification to 100% and select an area to watch while I apply the sharpening. I can then select the filter menu and in the sharpening submenu choose the unsharp mask filter. Now I'll apply a setting of 25% for the amount and then a radius of 25 pixels. Immediately we see the details snap into focus and the haze has gone from the highlights. Let's apply that, and if I hide and show the layer, you can see the difference it makes to the details. The only problem now with our sharpening trick is that we've affected the entire image. But what if we wanted to apply the effect so that we keep some of the haze in the highlights? For that, all we need to do is use the blending controls, which I explain in this video. I recommend watching that one next to see what's possible. Thanks for watching today and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you soon for another video.